Well, welcome everyone. If you haven't heard already, go ahead and sign in on the chat. Say your name, where you're from, and maybe a little tidbit about what's interested you about this topic and encouraged you to sign up. We have with us today Dr. Larry Cadwell. He has been working with the organization for a year or two now. He has I'm just going to let him introduce himself. He's got some really wonderful credentials, and I don't want to butcher them or get them wrong. So, Larry, if you could go ahead and introduce yourself, and then we'll get started.
Okay. Again, Larry Cadwell. I am an ecologist. I've got my undergraduate work at Purdue, went on to Washington State University, finally on to Colorado State University. And my particular specialty happens to be radiation ecology, and I'm not going to bother you with what that is. But probably for this purpose, maybe one of the better credentials that I have is simply being old. And in that regard, I live in northern Indiana. I grew up on a little farm in northern Indiana, left for about 50 years and came back. So my perspective and I spent a lot of time outdoors and a lot of time in the woods doing those kind of things. So my perspective is historically what happened in the decade of the 1950s. And I'm going to contrast that in terms of the biota for what's happening today. So let's take a look at the first slide. And as I say that, one of the things, I was sitting in class 50 years ago, and a professor said to me, or to the class, he said, "There is no substitute for intuition, biological know-how, and common sense." So although I'm going to cover just a little bit of the science to begin with, if you can associate with one or two of those things, that's probably all anybody really needs to know. The science isn't going to be overwhelming, and the ecology, the first slide that you see here, what is an ecologist? Most of you probably know, but an ecologist is someone who looks at the interactions between the abiotic, in other words, the non-living portion of the ecosystem, and the living. And when it comes to climate change, the first slide here, changing variables leading to environmental conditions, I've highlighted those. That's the abiotic side. And I want to just introduce those because everything we talk about that will be happening or is happening today and is going to happen in the future relates to and directly is derived from changes in these things. And I put atmospheric CO2 concentration at the top and underlined that. So obviously we don't have to talk about what's causing those. We know that CO2 levels and other gases such as methane and others are adding to our rise in temperature. So we'll go into a little bit of the detail of temperature. We don't need to talk about that much either because it is CO2 and the greenhouse effect that causes the Earth's temperature to rise, and indeed the sea's temperature to rise. But when we get to talking about local environment here, the state of Indiana, northern Indiana, are the fields and properties that we love to walk in and are maintaining. Rainfall is a little bit something different. We can understand CO2 concentrations going up, temperature going up, but rainfall, why rainfall? It's not the same everywhere, whereas these others are. The amount of, and I want to back up and describe to you why rainfall here may be completely different than other parts of the United States and other parts of the world, and how that relates to us. If you go down to the Gulf of Mexico and consider that we have a huge body of water down there, and that water absorbs heat much more readily and maintains it than the Earth's surface, the dry land surface that reflects it. So we have a mass of water in the Gulf of Mexico that's heating up, and the air above it is heating up. And so when that occurs, consider this mass of evaporation. The higher temperatures causing more evaporation, both of the atmospheric temperature and the temperature of the water. So we now have a mass of water moving up into the atmosphere, and that water is funneling to the north and coming to us. So we'll see some of how that's changing right here. So our rainfall is going to be different than other places, largely because of that. And it's going to be different in terms of the amount, the absolute total precipitation, whether measured in a year or a single event, when it occurs, the timing, and right here, we're seeing much more rainfall in late winter and early spring. And then the tendency is and predicted to be even more so in the future, drying out through the summer. So the sequence of rainfall events has been changing, is going to continue to change. And maybe one very important additional one is the intensity of rain. In other words, how much rain do we get in a single event, a single day, a single hour? And that's going up dramatically. So all of those things related to rainfall are changing, and they're changing very dramatically. And those are the things that cause a lot of the changes in the biota that we're seeing here all around us. Another one is relative humidity and absolute humidity. When we look at relative humidity, that has a lot to do with how our bodies respond. And as the humidity goes up, we absolutely, our body cannot handle that nearly as well. We don't evaporate cool, and our body temperature can go up. So that can be a dangerous situation. And another one, certainly related to the rainfall and to the warming, is wind velocity. So when the rainfall and these other parameters are changing, the wind velocity is changing with it. And the very last one is one that you probably haven't seen or heard much about. This is something that I've kind of put in, and it's based a little bit on some of my observations. And we'll talk about that a little later. I'll give you something to chew on there and think about that. But I just don't want to say about dew formation. There is a number called the dew point temperature. Maybe you know what it is. And it simply says, as this dew point temperature rises, and that's what it's doing right now, the time when dew forms. In other words, if you walk out in the morning into the grass, you're going to have dew on the grass or on other structures, and the temperature at which that occurs is rising. So that means it's occurring more frequently. So we're getting more dew, heavier dew, and it's a lot more frequent than it used to be. And there are certainly some changes related to that. So if we go on to the next slide, this slide shows the global temperature change. How much has it changed? And this is basically over recorded time from, say, where we've been recording temperature fairly accurately from late, say, in the 1880s to 2000. Don't worry about the fine print too much. Just concentrate on the right-hand side. And this says the past 7 years were the hottest 7 on record. And I think right now, officially, 2020 was the hottest year we've had. And I believe it's accurate that the 10 of the last 10 years have been the 10 hottest. So this is dramatic. This is something that's changing very, very much and very rapidly. And that's the point, how rapidly it's changing compared to the long-term average over the past. If we move on to the next slide.
I've lost it.
Okay.
I don't know why it's not advancing. Oh, there we go.
There we go. This is just another representation of the same thing. 1950 is about in the middle, and you can see on the right-hand side how rapidly it's going up. But we could actually take this slide right here and cross out at the top atmospheric surface temperature, and we could put in there ocean water temperature. So that the body of water that's heating up in the Gulf Coast, moving that water up here in a column of air mass, dropping that water to us. The reason for that is because the temperatures of the ocean and the air above it look exactly like the air temperatures here in terms of how they're responding through time. For the next one, I want to shift into, most of our talk will be regarding the biota and our natural systems, but the topic of this is really what's affecting us right here, northern Indiana. And I want to, if you're not familiar with the Union of Concerned Scientists, that's an organization it's a nonprofit organization that's really mission is to take and translate science information and make it available to the public. In 2019, they issued a report. It was about a 30-page report. This is simply the title from it, and it's about killer heat in the United States. If we take a look at the next slide, this will be, whoops, there we go. This is the cover of that article. The Union of Concerned Scientists also puts out a publication. It's 24 pages. It comes out quarterly, and this is the one in which they talked about killer heat, and the magazine itself is called The Catalyst. So if you're interested in not only climate change, but all the other concerning environmental issues that we have and how those are changing, this is what I would recommend as a good organization. I think it's maybe $25 a year to join, and the Catalyst is really a good publication where it condenses these things down for us to really fully understand the science without being a scientist. The next is the actual article itself from that, and the woman who wrote this was Pamela Worth. And Pamela made a trip in 2018 in July to Montreal. And she went up, and while she was there, she experienced one of the hottest days they'd ever had. They had 100 degrees up there. And as you probably can guess, that there's not much air conditioning or need for it, at least there didn't used to be, in Montreal. So she describes what happened there. She couldn't sleep. She took showers over the night. She'd get out of the shower, heat right back up. And the next day, she learned from the news that 70 people in Montreal had passed away. So this is just a little bit of a clue as to what's coming. Montreal, the only benefit that we have is that we have air conditioning here, but our climate and how things are changing right here and in the eastern part of the United States puts us at real extreme risk from notoriously high heat, and much more of it is coming. So if we go on to this one, how much is actually coming? This is for Indiana, and the historical average high temperature for the year would be 97 degrees. If we look at it, what's projected based on the CO2 concentrations and pretty simple modeling in terms of what can happen in the future, you can see in the 20s. And look, I should say, let's just focus on the red bars. Those are under a high emission scenario. And that means if we don't do much, in other words, very little effort on our part, which is something like maybe what we've been doing the last several years, to not address this in a very rigorous and extreme manner, these temperatures are going to rise through the 50s to that high temperature that used to be 97 will be 106, and into the late century, the 2080s, 111 degrees. And the orange bars simply say, well, if we do a pretty good job of controlling that, what are we looking at in those same timeframes? So if we can get CO2 emissions under control, it's going to be better, but it's still going to be bad. Next, please. And these, how do you know that this is becoming an issue? And if you got a little bit of gray hair or a lot, like perhaps I do, you can probably remember back when temperature was on the news, was reported on the weather reports as temperature. But in the last decade or so, or maybe two, we've started to use the heat index. Now, that's a fairly recent thing. but I can remember in about 50 some years ago, I was at boot camp at Fort Riley, Kansas. And it got hot there. And in fact, we did have wasn't called the heat index. Back then, this was called the temperature humidity index. So right now on the news, it's going to be feels like or heat index. And so the numbers of 90 is where we have a really tough time outside if we're out there working. And I don't know what you do during the day in the summertime, but I know the last few years here myself, if I've got things to do outside, and if it's anything rigorous at all, I get up at 6 o'clock in the morning in the summertime, I go out there, and by 10:30 or 11 o'clock, I probably have to come in, change my shirt, take a shower, and hibernate for a few hours, and then maybe go back out in the evening. So even a heat index of 90, if you're working out, is stressful. If it gets to 100, those of us that are perhaps obese, old, young, or infirm for some other reason are really at risk. If it gets to 105, it's anybody, even the healthy people out there are going to have a tough time. And then there's these models that they use for calculating heat index are made from empirical data, which means we've looked at what happens in the past, how people feel, and we've conducted the models. But the heat index is predicted to go on fewer days really off the charts. We don't know what's going to happen. But if that were to happen, you can see it says undetermined in that lower right hand, off that right hand heat index chart. Exposure is presumed extremely dangerous for all people, likely to result in heat-related illness or even death. So that's pretty dire. Let's take a look at the next one. Let's switch to carbon dioxide now, because this is what's really driving the whole thing. And if you look at the lower right-hand corner, you'll see a 0 down below. That's today, well, actually 2019 to be more precise. And we're going back 800,000 years. And you can see how CO2 levels have changed with the interglacial periods and the ice age, and there's been about 8 or 9 of those over the last 800 years, or basically one every 100,000 years. But look at the extreme right and above. Prior to recent times, the highest ever recorded or determined, I shouldn't say recorded, there was nobody back there, there weren't even people back there then, but determined concentration was 300 parts per million. Where are we now? We're about 410, and we're heading up dramatically from there. So again, off the charts kinds of things, really concerning. Part of the reason why, if we don't do something dramatic and soon, it's not going to be pretty. So let's take a look at the next slide. Well, what does this mean? There was a professor or scientist, I should say, I don't know if he's a professor or not, at our agricultural research lab on the East Coast, I think Bethesda perhaps. And he looked at some plants. He looked at poison ivy, he looked at Canada thistle and soybeans. And of course, this was agriculturally related. But what does it mean for us here? And we right now, if we compare to 1960, today, we have about twice the amount of poison ivy that we have in terms of biomass. And these are the projections. And what he was able to do was he had chambers where he could actually grow these in under concentrations that would be similar to what we would expect the way climate change and CO2 concentrations are going. So if you're someone that's outside or even in your backyard, or you like to be on the Heinze Land Trust properties, you can expect to see a lot more. And in fact, again, from 1960 to today, we're at twice the mass right now. And the other thing that they saw, the indication was that not only that, but the toxic oils in the plant were perhaps more concentrated. So these are some of the kinds of things that can happen. Now poison ivy is not necessarily such a bad plant if you exclude what it does to people, because we're the only ones that are susceptible to those oils. The deer love to eat the plant. There's a lot of other small mammals and birds that eat the berries. So there's nothing wrong with poison ivy except from the perspective of what it does to us. But looking toward the future, much more poison ivy and perhaps more toxic poison ivy. We're not, I'm going to stay on that last one for a little bit. We'll just keep that one up there. But the other thing he looked at was Canada thistle. Now, the Canada thistle is an invasive plant, whereas poison ivy is a native plant, but it can become invasive. It looks like it's on its way to being invasive, but still native. Canada thistle is a plant that's reproduces by root system. And what they found when he went through and increased the concentration of CO2, that the plant itself didn't look any different above ground. But what he found was that the below ground root system, the biomass in that root system, was 2 to 3 times greater. What did that mean? What are the implications? Well, the implied implication is that that is a plant that can really take over in a pasture environment. It's going to be much more, if it's invasive now, it's going to be much more so. But even beyond that, that because the only effective way to control it is with some pretty harsh chemicals. And if you're going to use something like Roundup, which is one of them, it takes a couple of applications or more to kill it today, but even more herbicide will be required to kill this plant in the future with its much more massive root system. It's simply, the root system is able to dilute the chemical, so it's going to take more. So one of the implications, we're going to have to use more pesticide to control some of this kind of invasive plant. So the point is, we can't tell, and very few plants that we know about today, do we really know exactly how they're going to respond to these. A few of them have been looked at, but most of them don't. So whatever we have in the environment today, there could be many, many different kinds of responses, but we don't know right now what they are. He did work with one other plant, and that was soybeans. And soybeans are produced extensively in the United States, in China, and in Brazil. And the yield, and because CO2 is in fact beneficial and necessary for the growth of the plant, we require oxygen and they require CO2, but the more CO2, sometimes the better the plant grows, as we've seen with poison ivy. And so the records show that on average with China, the United States, and Brazil, the yields of soybean are up about 5%. Okay, so a modest gain in that. But then when he took and put this, a number of different varieties of soybean in the growth chambers and grew them up, he found out that the potential was anywhere from a 15% to an 85% increase in yield for those plants. So, so picking out the right variety and looking to the year 2060 to 2080 and beyond, you could almost be doubling the yield of soybean. That doesn't mean that that's necessarily a good thing. And maybe if everything else stays the same, it would be, but we don't know about the quality of that bean or the oil content or the fiber or the protein level, and all of those things could very well change as well. So we don't know a lot about how plants change, but we do know that they do increase, of course, with levels of CO2. Okay, now if we go on and look at Indiana precipitation. This is data from Purdue Climate Change Research Center. I got these slides from Dr. Kevin Tunsvik. And this was from 2016. And just look at the state of Indiana and how precipitation has changed from the historic values in terms of inches. For us up here in the northwest corner of the state, 5.5 inches. You go down to the southern part of the state, almost 7 inches of additional precipitation we're already seeing. And that number, actually, if we were to recalculate these numbers today, I'm sure that each of those would be higher because the last 2 or 3 years, we've had some pretty good amounts of rainfall. So let's go on to take a look at the next slide. This is again one of his slides, and he says changes in Indiana and the Midwest, increased extreme precipitation events, persistent wet patterns may happen any time of the year, increased relative humidity and nighttime temperatures. Okay, thinking back to killer heat, when the humidity goes up, the temperature effects are much greater. Nighttime temperatures going up. More irregular precipitation and a greater likelihood of summer dry spells. So this has a lot of implications for our natural systems and for our agriculture. And even though the springs may be great, we're looking at increased droughts during the summer. Has a lot of implications for the changes of species in natural systems. And then also the last point there, longer growing season and milder winters. So let's go on to the next one. This is not the amount of precipitation. This is these numbers right here are the extreme precipitation events. In other words, the greatest storms that we tend to see, what you might call a gully washer, how frequently do they occur? And if you look at the dark blue number, let's look at the upper right-hand corner chart there. That's the one of the, with the blue, dark blue, and simply the upper Northwest. Yeah, right up there. And the number 42, that's right where we are. That's the number of these particular events in the 99th percentile, meaning the highest rainfall events. We're seeing a lot more of those. Again, huge implications, because when the intensity of the rainfall increases, the surface runoff increases, the leaching of nutrients from our soil systems, the amount of water in our streams, lakes, rivers, the amount of water flowing into the Gulf of Mexico, which might be laden with nutrients, is going to increase. And then if you look at the lower right-hand corner, this doesn't relate so much to us, but if you look at the Southwest, it's actually fewer of those. So we are in a particular location where, because of the influence of the Gulf of Mexico, the higher precipitation, more intense precipitation, those can produce some pretty dramatic effects. I took a look, and I was able for Indianapolis to find some numbers for the greatest rainfall event each year in Indianapolis from 1948 through 2018, I believe it was, 2019. And I took the 5 years from 48 to 52 and the 5 years from 14 to 19, and I just compared them. And the 5-year average for the greatest amount of rain in any one day from 48 to 52 was 2.95 inches. From 2015 to 2019, that increased to 3.73 inches. That's pretty dramatic. That's a 26% increase in the amount of rainfall that occurred over that period of time. Okay, let's go ahead and take the next one. For our forests, and I did mention already the Purdue Climate Change Research Center, and there's about 90 scientists there, and they're in all multiple disciplines, but some of them are in forestry. And so this is some of the information I got from that location. And what are we expected to see as we get toward the end of the current century in our forests? And we're going to see, if we don't check pretty dramatically, the increase in CO2 coming into our environment, and all of the resultant changes from that. We're going to see drastic increases in drastic changes in the species composition. In other words, if you were to go on a Shirley Heinze Trust property and go out and take a complete inventory today, put that paper away and have your grandchild at the same age that you are today go out and look at it, the place is not going to look the same. It's going to be dramatically different in terms of the species that are there. Short-term increase in productivity. Again, we talked about CO2 and that going up. Again, this is from the perspective of forestry, and a lot of this has to do with the forestry related to production of timber. So productivity is something they looked at in the short term, but in the long term, as the other influences start to occur, the CO2 might be masked over by much more severe winds, much more severe rainfall and flooding of the forest, blowdowns, and others. In the long term, a decrease in productivity. More flooding and more pathogens and more disease in the forest. Because most of our forests are harvested in the wintertime, so that the heavy equipment that's working the forest doesn't damage the forest floor, greater difficulty in harvesting our forest. Poor regeneration, in other words, seedling survival under extreme wet conditions in the spring will probably be decreased. More invasive species, kudzu, for example, moving up into this area. A decrease in forest products, and some of that has to do with the change in individual species, but they mentioned sugar maple, white pine, and Christmas trees and then we already mentioned in the past an increase in drought summer. So we may actually start to see forest fires where, for me here, I don't think I can ever recall having seen a forest fire here, but that could be on our radar for the future at the way we're headed. So for the next one, please. This is just an example of Oriental Bittersweet. I know that the trust is, and Christine in particular, has many volunteers trying to control various kinds of invasives, and this is just a good example of a horrible one. I don't know that this one is worse now and actually advantaged by climate change, but my guess is that it probably is one of them. Let's take a look at the next slide. This is also from Purdue. What about the central Indiana flatwoods? And they say that many of these are surrounded by agricultural lands, and I don't know if that occurs for our flatwoods up here, if it's true. But what they're predicting is that actually the greater amount of rainfall will compensate for some of the tile drains that are built around to drain the surrounding agricultural lands, and it may actually help the flatwoods. Let's take a look at the next one. I want to just direct on this slide to plant hardiness zones. And let's look at the upper right-hand corner, and you see the little box comes down to St. Joe County. So this is for St. Joe County and what our climate zones are. If you're a gardener, you probably know all about them. If you're another biologist and not a gardener, you may also know, but this is plant hardiness, and the warmer the temperature, the longer the growing season, and the bigger the number on the zone. So I'm a county away, and maybe you are a county or two away from St. Joe County, but what we're predicting, what is being predicted under, again, the red would be the high emission, in other words, doing less to try and control greenhouse gases from the 20s, going from zone 5 to zone 6, and finally up toward the end of the century to zone 7. Okay, let's take a look at the next slide and put these in terms of a map. This is actually a zone map. And now you can see from the southern tip of Lake Michigan there, that dark forest green, is zone 5. And now look where zone 7 occurs. That's down through northern Alabama, Tennessee, down in that area. If you just now imagine from what we just saw, what the projection to be, to move this yellow zone, shift it up to the southern tip of Lake Michigan. If you can only imagine the amount of change that's going to occur, it's going to a lot of change in the individual species, uh, that are likely to be able to grow in this area. And if you think about this as not necessarily a climate zone map, but as a vegetation map, in a sense, you can use it that way. Because if we look at zone 7, zones, other animals as well, we could see loblolly pine, and there's kudzu, and maybe even armadillos. Move that up to northern Indiana and think the same way. So toward the end of the century, if we don't get our current rate of change and climate under control, kinds of things we're looking at. And if you go up into southern central Michigan, you know, we have northern coniferous forest, we have pine forest. Move those clear out well up into Canada. Okay, for the next one, this climate change doesn't just affect or it's not just climate change that affects our environment. In the Gulf of Mexico, we've talked about that. We know that agriculture really makes a lot of nutrients available. And with the increased intensity of rain, with the increased runoff, those kind of things, what we're seeing is a dead zone. And it varies from year to year, but it's a huge dead zone that results from blue-green algae growth or cyanobacteria growing out into the Gulf of Mexico. And you might say, okay, that is certainly an agricultural thing, but climate has a huge, huge impact on that. And you only need to go south from where you are probably right now down to the Kankakee River area and the flatlands down there and all the agricultural fields that are drained with tiles, the tiles into ditches, the ditches into the Kankakee into the Illinois into the Mississippi. And I looked up to see, well, just how much do we get out of that? And in terms of one nutrient at all, one nutrient alone. And for the nitrates at all, it's almost 1 million metric tons a year. So now I want to just that's the Gulf of Mexico. Let's come a little closer to home. Think about Lake Erie. You've probably heard about this. There was an article in the South Bend Tribune this summer. And also Green Bay. Massive growth of blue-green algae in those freshwater ecosystems. Moving up a little closer to home, you may all be familiar with Lake Worcester at Potato Creek State Park. And there was a recent article in there about the blue-green algae growing there. And again, Lake Worcester and Potato Creek was dammed up to make that lake, and it's only about a 45-year-old lake. For years and years, there wasn't, it was a natural-looking lake, but within the last few years, I had noticed from just reading the paper that there were blue-green algae outbreaks there, and they were recommending people, and that blue-green algae can be toxic to dogs. So if you get your dog out and it laps the water, you know, your dog could die. So a couple of days ago, I called and talked to the naturalist there, and of course they weren't excited to tell me a lot about that aspect of it. And the lady there hadn't been there long, so she couldn't tell me a whole lot about what was happening. But a friend of mine who I then talked to had been going there for about 40 years. And I said, well, when did this really start? And she said, it's only been the last few years. So the agriculture has been there longer than that. The chemicals have been in the system longer than that. But now what we're seeing is with more intense rainfall, much more flooding, much more leaching of nutrients, much more channeling of those nutrients into our bodies of water, and now the toxic blue-green algae growing there. Let's bring it drill it down a little closer to home. We got as far as Lake Erie and Green Bay. In Rolling Prairie, I'm from Rolling Prairie, and we have a conservation trail behind the Rolling Prairie Elementary School. And this little body of water here has tells you several different stories, but it didn't exist prior to spring of 2018. And that's when we got massive rainfall amounts in the spring. We got flooding, water tables came up, the ponds, this particular little wetland enlarged. So the area where you see right now in 2017 was dry. The tree that you see standing, or the little trees and the bigger tree out in that wetland, and this has been wet ever since then, it hasn't gone down. This wetland, the trees there have been killed as a result of the water table coming up and the pond level rising. So that's one effect. And I'm sure that you on trust properties are probably seeing a lot of the same things. On our farm right here in Indiana, I'm seeing some of the same things. We've got little ponds on this farm that are now higher and covering property they've never covered in the past. But what do we see on the surface of that? I can't tell you that for sure, and maybe some of you know better than I can't tell you that that's blue-green algae, but I can tell you that it's a growth on the surface that didn't occur until this year. And this picture was taken on the 20th of October of this year. So real dramatic changes. Maybe you can say the system is functioning as it should because we're dependent on these wetlands to filter our water, and perhaps that's occurring and the good thing, but it just shows you the kinds of change that we're starting to see. Okay, let me change gears again, and this is something that I haven't found from the literature much about, but it's something I've been observing. And we live in a house that's on the same location in a house where I grew up. We simply took the old house down, put a new one up, and it's been 8 years that I've been in this new house. And my wife a year or two ago started to say, well, you know, we got a lot of mildew growing on the house. And I thought, I wonder about that. And then here within just the last couple of years, in the summertime, I've been noticing now we have dew collection of water on the outside of the windows of the house. And even 8 years ago, I wasn't seeing that. And so then I'm starting to think, and I go to the literature and I'm trying to look to see what's happening. And I'll tell you a little bit about the garden as well. But what I'm seeing is that there is more dew collecting. And what would you, if you had to prescribe to grow mildew or mold on the side of your house, you would say, well, let's increase the temperature. Let's increase the nighttime temperature. Let's increase the relative humidity. And let's make dew that actually collects on that overnight more prevalent so that in the day when the sun comes out, that place is already covered with water. So so those of you who have been around for a few years or decades, I should say, I'd be interested in hearing what you have seen. And this certainly seems to occur more on vinyl siding than others, but this is a house that's only down the road from me a few miles, about 3 miles away. And as I drive between where I live and LaPorte, I can pick out a lot of houses that look just like this. I can tell you that back when I was a kid, I didn't see any of this kind of thing happening at all. And if you drive down the road, I cross Highway 20, go there, and for within the last year or two, I've seen signs that said pressure washing your house and a phone number. Never saw those before. So things are telling me that this is one of the kinds of things, and I'd be interested in hearing the opinion of those of you who've been around long enough to see this. Are you seeing the very same thing that I'm seeing? In other words, something that didn't happen before is happening now. And I actually went online to look at house cleaning, and I actually saw a recommendation that you wash your house with water and vinegar every year. How many of us are looking forward to that? Let's go to the next one. I'm a gardener. Many of you may be gardeners, and I've gardened in a lot of different places around the United States. But coming back here and remembering, I first started my very first garden. I was 10 years old, And that was back about 1950, I guess I would say, or a little later, early 50s. And I've been growing a lot of these, but tomatoes and other things. And when I go out in the garden today, since I've been here, I noticed that in the morning, go out and it looks like it's rained, but it hasn't. In other words, there's not just a little dew, but the tomato plants are completely covered. And I also am a past owner of a cherry orchard in, maybe you know, or maybe you don't, that cherries are thin-skinned. They collect solids, and that's sugar. And when they get wet, they'll split. And here, for the first time ever, I'm now seeing a lot of our tomatoes splitting. And I grow a little small cherry tomato, and I virtually cannot pick a ripe tomato that isn't split. In other words, if I'm going to have any of these cherry tomatoes at all, we have to pick them 2 or 3 days before they're ripe and bring them in, because every day, every night during the season when they're ripening, the dew comes, it completely covers them. And osmosis is the name of the technical process, but it actually pulls the moisture through the skin and splits the fruit. Well, that's just one aspect of gardening. What are the other kinds of things I'm seeing? And maybe you know, if you've raised tomatoes, that there's a lot of fungal diseases and bacterial diseases and that sort of thing. And I'm seeing a lot more of that. It's very difficult for me now to keep a tomato plant alive past, the middle of August, the end of August, almost exclusively one disease or another has killed it. And many of those diseases are fungal diseases or even bacterial diseases. And those things grow best under the conditions of high moisture, high humidity. And now that those plants look like they've been drenched simply every night from dew, that's one of the impacts that I'm seeing. Okay, let's go on to some critters. As the world warms up, this Stanford researcher telling us about mosquitoes and disease-carrying mosquitoes that can survive in more parts of the earth. And indeed, what we're seeing, if you wanted to prescribe a better way to increase the population of mosquitoes, you would certainly extend the growing season. If that's plants, you call it the growing season. If it's the mosquitoes, you're going to extend the mosquito breeding season. You're going to have higher populations. You're going to have, they tell you to dump out your water supplies, but with the ponds filling up with more exposed water, we now have more habitat for mosquitoes. And with the warming, we actually are able to see new species of mosquitoes that are moving up from the south that didn't used to be here. And if you know much about the diseases of mosquitoes, certain species or certain genera of mosquitoes carry different diseases. So back when I was a kid, I spent a lot of time outside. I might have gotten a few mosquito bites. Never once did my parents say to me, hey, you got to be careful of West Nile virus. Or, oh my gosh, we got concerned about Eastern Equine Encephalitis. I'm not saying that those things didn't exist, but the populations of mosquitoes were not to the point where, or even the disease may not have been here. But with the climate changing, we certainly are seeing that. And if we go on to the next slide, what happened now, depending on what county you're in, but this summer, I think it was on, what was it, the middle of September? I think it was actually the 23rd of September. Several northern Indiana counties were sprayed. And this was a general purpose spray. I was downstairs. I had heard that they were planning to spray. I knew that Eastern Equine Encephalitis was in the local county area here. And I knew that one person had died and a number of horses had been killed by it. Now, horses can be vaccinated, but not so much for people. So the local authorities made the decision, and they actually aerial sprayed about 400,000 acres here over a several county area. And I don't think it went into Porter County, but it was certainly LaPorte County and to the east and south. So this event, I was downstairs watching television. My wife was upstairs, and I heard her yell, and I thought, it was in the evening, what is going on? And she heard this roar and saw a flash. And I rushed upstairs and didn't see anything. I said, was there a car down the road that did that? No, she said there wasn't. She looked out. It was the aerial plane coming over. And it was just after dark. And actually, there were two of them side by side. And I went out, stood for a while, and pretty soon they came back on another pass, and I could tell what it was. The next day I went out. What did I see? I went out into the garden, and there's a bumblebee, about 10:30 in the morning, laying on the ground, spinning in circles. So the herbicide treatment, as a result of the insect population, the mosquito population carrying the disease organism, was enough to trigger this massive aerial spraying program. This is what we have to look forward to in spades, perhaps not a single event, the first time it's ever occurred that I'm aware of, but now a specific disease, a specific host, and we're looking at more of those hosts, more varied diseases, different types of mosquitoes, etc. Let me also tell you a little bit about ticks. Again, when I was a kid back in the 50s, I wandered through all the same properties, much like what Shirley Heinze is maintaining right now. I don't remember ever getting a tick on me. I don't recall ever any precautions. And in fact, I'm not even sure back then we had insect repellent. I don't remember that. But there was, to my knowledge, no such thing as Lyme disease. But what we're seeing now is, with the changing climate, we're seeing more ticks. We're seeing more varieties of tick. The one that carries Lyme disease, I think, is the black-legged tick, or better known as the deer tick. Now, we do have more deer, so that may be part of it, but I don't think that's the whole story. The whole of it is that the environment is much more conducive to greater populations. And so I went online the other day to look up to see what kind of diseases and how many diseases were carried. And I think I came up with 16 different diseases that are carried by different species of ticks. And the black-legged ticks carry several of those. So only 3 of those had I ever known about before. I knew of Rocky Mountain spotted fever. I knew of Colorado tick fever, and recently, of course, of Lyme disease. A few weeks ago, I asked my sister, I said, well, we didn't used to have Lyme disease. And she said, oh, yes, we did. And I said, back when we were kids? And she said, oh, no. So I think we can look forward to more of the insects that we don't like to have, and actually more diseases and more efforts to fight those diseases, more pesticides, etc. Okay, that's the end of the slides. If we can bring it back, I just have a few other little things to go over here. Some of the other things that I have seen that didn't occur in the 60s right now: water over the roadways. We mentioned the ponds going up. That's common here in northern LaPorte County. I've seen it a number of times in places that I had never seen 60 years ago. I mentioned the woodlots that we have. I'm seeing now, and have seen recently, mature, healthy trees blowing down, never having recalled having seen that in the past. What's going on? Well, let's go back to the variables of climate. We've had more rainfall. We have more intense rainfall. So if we have a lot of rain in a short period of time, we saturate the soil. When the soil is saturated, the wind that we talked about often accompanies that. And so now I am seeing not just the old and the damaged trees, or the ones that have died from some other reason, but mature, healthy trees that in the past never actually blew down, now blowing down in our forests. We also have up here, our forest is in the moraine properties here. It's hilly, gully. And we have probably in the 1800s when this was logged, they probably overlogged some, and there were some gullies that actually formed then. But in the years after that, they stabilized. And back when I was a kid running around, the gullies were there, but they weren't active. I come back and I look in the decade of 2010s, and now we have head cutting, 30-foot deep gullies actively forming new gullies that didn't occur before. So that relates to the intensity of rainfall that we're seeing, I think, as well. What else? Local flooding. I think the St. Joe River has recently flooded, and according to the reports I saw, we have had, or they have had, 2 500-year floods in the past 5 years. 2 500-year floods should occur over a period of 1,000 years, theoretically. What happened in 2019 to farmers in the area? You remember all the rainfall that occurred. If you traveled south from your area and to the east, there were many, many fields that were flooded, and they didn't drain in time to actually plant the crop. So throughout much of the upper Midwest, all of the rainfall intensified in that period of time in the early spring, didn't allow the fields to drain, and either crops were planted late or not planted at all, losing productivity. A couple of other things, just in general in our gardens, I mentioned the tomatoes, but other plants as well. I'm seeing more disease than I used to see. There could be a variety of reasons for it, but I think many of them are related to the environmental conditions resulting from climate change. So that's, let's see. I guess the question is, perhaps what can we do locally? What can we do individually? We can take personal responsibility for ourselves for what we do in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. So the obvious things are to use vehicles that get better mileage, perhaps even electric or plug-in automobiles, that kind of thing. We can certainly encourage our political leaders to understand the problems and act with regard to climate change in a responsible way that will limit our greenhouse gas emissions. We can embrace mitigation and adaptation strategies, and many of those you can go and find. I mentioned the 90 or so researchers at Purdue at Purdue in the Climate Change Research Group, Center. And if you access that, you can actually see what they're doing. Many of them are related to agriculture, but certainly other disciplines as well. We need to breed new plants and different plant species that are going to be able to survive in the climate that we're going to be looking at in the future. If we go to Purdue and that research center, they're looking at, in conjunction, climate, health, the forest, urban green spaces, agriculture, aquatic ecosystems, tourism and recreation, energy, water, and infrastructure. I think with that, I think our hour is up just about, and I'd be more than happy to take your questions.
Great. Well, thank you, Larry. That was wonderful. Through the chat, we've had several other people agree that they've also had mildew growing on their houses and had splitting tomatoes and some other issues. One of the questions that came up, though, was how does spraying impact other insects? You had mentioned the mosquitoes, but what other insects are being impacted by that sort of spraying, especially pollinators?
Absolutely. We don't have an insecticide that's specific for mosquitoes. So the insecticides used, and I don't know the ones that were used, and I can't tell you for sure. They tried to do that spraying at a time when the mosquitoes would be out and many of the other insects would not be directly exposed. And I can't tell you, I took a video and I have it of the bumblebee that I told you about. And when I first saw that bumblebee, the morning after, it could fly about 2 feet and then lay on the ground and spin in circles. Now, I can't tell you that was a result of that spraying, but I can tell you that I've never seen that happen before. So the insecticides are non-specific, they're general, and certainly we can expect pollinators to take a deep hit if we're needing to spray those kinds. So it's a very difficult question. You have human health and potentially lethal diseases on one hand, and the environment on the other, and which way are you going to go? You know, a difficult question.
Exactly. Nancy Moldenauer had brought up the Senate Bill 389 that just passed through the committee. I'm not sure if you're aware of that. Have you heard about the wetland regulations that are potentially going to be decreased or even eliminated?
No, I haven't.
Okay. If anyone is interested in learning more about Senate Bill 389, Sarah did put a link in the chat for an article from the Indy Star. And our volunteer, Sarah Pavlovic, also happened to mention that if anyone is interested in education, especially for kindergarten through 12th grade, there's a link to the Purdue Ag website for K through 12 teachers. So if you're interested in the education piece, Sarah put a link in there as well. Does anyone else have any questions?
I could add just, if you don't have any more questions, I could add just a little bit more here. And this is something I thought a little bit about. What are the implications for us in our own backyards, or for the Shirley Heinze stewardship and management of properties? And you know, one of the things that is occurring, and I guess I didn't mention that, but the change in species and the number of forest species that's occurring. And let me see if I can find the numbers on that. But as those species change, the ones that are going to work here are not going to be the same. And it's pretty dramatic. So we're going to have a decline in some of the species, increase in some of the species that are here, and new species moving in. So if, as a manager of a property or planting a tree in your own backyard, if you're not looking at what that particular tree species will do in the future, then you might be planting the wrong thing, because 20 or 30 years from now, as climate has changed, the species that you have and think you want to have in your, perhaps in your backyard, you want to plant a tree and you think it's a maple. Well, some of the species that are likely, according to Purdue, to be decreasing are maples, and the oaks may be going up. So the choice of what you plant on new properties or what you plant in your own backyard may not necessarily be best based on what you would like to have there, what you think has done there well in the past, but what might do there in the future. And some of the things that Purdue is doing is looking at new genotypes and how to do modifications to adapt various kinds of plants so that they will do better under those conditions. So we could come up with, you know, we're basically playing God here, but to catch up with the changes in climate, we might need a new plant that will do better than those in the past. And one of the things they pointed out with regard to forests is that as those species of trees decline, certain ones, that's going to leave voids in there, because insects and humans and small mammals and that are pretty mobile, but those trees, particularly the large seeded ones, are not going to be able to follow that climate change moving up through as rapidly as we would like for them to do that. So that's going to leave some voids, and that may be part of the reason why invasives are much more likely to take their place in the meantime. So selecting the species for your backyard, I mentioned the blowdown of trees. Do you want to plant, if you want a shade tree, and with climate change, you may want a shade tree because you can get a lot with a shade tree in your backyard. You may want one, but do you want to plant one that has a shallow root system that will blow over in the wind in 25 years with high intensity rainfall? Or do you want a deep taprooted species that's likely to stand up and continue to shade your property? So those are different questions, different than what's a beautiful tree or what doesn't leave litter in my yard. Maybe that's another metric in terms of how we select and use and buy trees for our properties.
That's awesome. So we did have some comments pop up. Jesse Becerra, who is a permaculture voice on Facebook, had mentioned that black oaks are very adaptable to dry environments. So that's something to keep in mind if you are interested in planting. We did have two other questions. Larry had asked if you could talk about the possible impacts on Lake Michigan. And Dave Dornberg had asked, do you believe that we only have 60 years left for most of our ag fields? So we've got two different questions, one asking about impacts on Lake Michigan and another one asking about if we really only have 60 years left.
Well, as far as Lake Michigan is concerned, I did go to a talk from a professor from Purdue North Central, a geologist, and she was talking about the changes in the shoreline of Lake Michigan. And obviously we know that the water levels have been at near record levels this past year, that the waves have been pretty intense and we've had a lot of shore erosion. So there is and she pointed out about a 30-year cycle of the Lake Michigan being high and low. And we are at about that high 30-year cycle. So what has climate change done to that? And I don't think anybody knows the answer to that, but I think it's highly likely that perhaps we're at an all-time record high because of the additional precipitation that we're now seeing in the state, and maybe the greater intensity of wind. So more wind, more waves, more lakeside erosion. Certainly, I would have to think it's logical to assume that some of that is certainly related to how our climate is changing and not all to the historic 30-year cycle. And the second question was about?
Do you believe that we only have 60 years left for most of our ag fields?
It depends a lot on what we do. If we become very aggressive and actually take pretty dramatic steps within the next decade or two to reduce the emissions of CO2, I think that we can, with the help of adaptation and the new mitigation plants and new techniques that agriculture will survive. I don't think we're looking at a complete loss of it, but we're looking at pretty diminished productivity and more bad years than good years, perhaps, something like that. So I think it's highly dependent on how we respond with to climate CO2 gases and other gases. Of course, the better job we do, the more quote unquote normal things will be. But right now, all of the predictions, another thing I should say, I was first involved. I've never really professionally worked in this area, except that about 25 years ago, I was a research scientist at Pacific Northwest National Laboratory. That's one of our Department of Energy sites. And I was on a working group to look at something called cap and trade. In other words, how do we cap our greenhouse emissions and trade? If somebody wants to start a new business or endeavor that releases more carbon, that we tax that to a certain extent and take that money and pay somebody else, like a farmer, to plant more crops that would have more biomass and would store and capture carbon. So in other words, we're trying to keep the balance instead of a carbon balance continuously rising. If somebody needs to put it up, let them pay for that so that somebody else can help lower it and not let the net carbon into the environment go up. We only had 2 or 3 meetings and that died for, I would say, political purposes. So
Sarah,
we know how that goes.
Sarah's got some questions from Facebook. So Sarah, what do you got for us?
All right. So kind of to follow up on this agricultural discussion, Martha said that she saw a movie on Netflix about low-till soil management. It's called Kiss the Ground. She recommends it. And she asks, so what about low-till management could help?
Yeah, well, there's two things there. One of them is cover crops, and the other is no-till or minimum till kinds of agriculture. And there's a lot being done and a lot available. And I can recommend a couple of books on this. And one of them is called From Dirt to Soil, and the other one is Perilous Bounty. And what you're getting into is this concept called regenerative agriculture. And what the point is, before we got into all of the intensive chemical use and the pesticides and fertilizer, there was a lot more crop rotation, a lot more cover over the land, and many of the problems that we have weren't occurring. So right now, part of our farm here is farmed. It's farmed by a farmer who does use cover crops, and there is never a time when there's not a crop growing on the land. So as soon as a crop comes out, whether it's in the past it's been soybeans or corn, immediately thereafter it's seeded. Sometimes in the past it was actually aerial seeded. So that might germinate in the fall. Some of it might grow through the winter. Some of it might germinate very early in the spring. And then that's actually keeps that cover on there. When the cover is there, the nutrients are absorbed by the roots of those plants. And then when that plant is tilled down, either right at seeding time or even now they're green, what they're calling green planting. So they'll plant into that cover crop while it's still green, and then actually terminate it. And oftentimes, unfortunately, that's done with herbicides again, but that's for the cover crop. And the other thing is the no-till or minimum till kind of thing, and those are used. But unfortunately, in terms of how many farmers have adapted that, just get out next time you go for a drive through the country, look and see, this is the time of year to look. How many absolutely bare fields do you see, and how many do you see with a cover crop? And up in our area, we're seeing a fair number, and this particular farmer that farms our land does that with everything he farms. But you don't have to go far, and I would say that the percentage of agricultural lands here in the state is probably less than 20% that actually use either the cover crop or the no-till or minimum till or strip till technology. So the technology is there. The challenge is to get the farmers to use it. And many of them have been doing what they've been doing for as long as they've been doing it. And that's the way they want to do it. We're all that way. Change is hard, but regenerative agriculture is real. You can get the same kinds of yields, or let me say this, maybe the yield will be a little less, but if you use less chemicals in it, the total net back to the land and back to the farmer, this can be done without a loss. In other words, some of these in the book Dirt to Soil, the farmer was actually in a rotation where one year he didn't have any cash crop on it at all. He just grew a cover crop with a lot of diverse species that put nitrogen back into the soil, put organic matter into the soil. The concept is called soil health. And actually that improved the yields from the other years such that he didn't lose any money by doing it. And he put far less chemical in terms of nutrients, chemical fertilizers, and in terms of pesticides and herbicides on the landscape. So regenerative agriculture, I think, has a lot of promise. We just need to be able to get it more widely adapted.
Kind of going back to the question about mosquitoes. So Laura asked on Facebook, how are mosquito predators impacted by the spraying, and how might this affect the eventual populations of the mosquitoes?
I really don't know about the mosquito predators. I haven't seen anything of that in the literature, but if those mosquito predators are insect predators, theoretically our bats should be doing quite well, and our tree swallows and barn swallows should be doing quite well with this, but I don't think the spray is going to affect the impact much, if at all, the bird predators, but the insect predators, clearly I would think they would be impacted as well. And the insects that are out and present, and they clearly tried to spray that early evening. That's when the mosquitoes come out. That's when many of the other insects are theoretically at least pulled back into wherever they spend the night and not directly exposed. So they try to use a chemical that's not going to have a carryover, obviously. They want to contact poison that kills what it contacts and nothing else. But, that may or may not work very well, who knows?
So we have another question. Aaron was asking that we're always talking about trees for climate control and carbon offsetting. What could be the role for prairies, and how do we get that into the climate conversation?
Well, prairie fits the bill very, very well. And in fact, our little farm here, we just planted 8 acres of pollinators last month. And what you see with the prairie species, they're perennial plants. They're much more deeply rooted. So in terms of capturing carbon and sequestering carbon, a prairie plant is far superior than, let's say, obviously your lawn, which is a shallow grass that really does almost nothing. So if we can convert, and many of us like to have, I don't know why people are fascinated with mowing 2 acres of lawn, but I'm not one of them. That's kind of where that goes.
One other question from Facebook from Janice is oak wilt an issue in this area?
Is what?
Is oak wilt an issue in this area, or are there is there anything to show that oak wilt might become more of an issue due to climate change?
I'm not familiar with, but I'll bet you can get the answer to that at the on the Purdue forestry page of their research group. I know we do have concerns over the years. We've had some pretty drastic plant diseases for the forest, and starting with the chestnut blight 110 years ago or so. A Dutch elm disease in the 1950s pretty well took out the American elm, although elms still limp by, but we don't have big, robust, mature trees. And now, of course, the insect ash borer kind of things. There's a disease of walnut called 1,000 cankers. That's a concern. It's not so much right here, but I think it's occurring in maybe the southern part of the state. The oak wilt, I'm not familiar with that, but it seems like we're picking off our major forest species one at a time. We've been doing a pretty good job of that every couple of decades. So,
yeah, and I can add to that. I've heard oak wilt has become an issue close to Ann Arbor. So I think it is to the north of us, and maybe it'll expand down. So it's a concern, and I do believe there are some nursery species that had to be quarantined last year due to it, but I don't know anything more specific than that.
Is any suggestion that that's related to our changing climate, or have you seen?
I'm not sure either. Yeah, I haven't seen anything specific.
Another question that may not be very directed at you. Tim asked, what is being done to evaluate and identify natural areas in Northwest Indiana, and how likely are more acres to be preserved? So I'll offer this to you if you'd like to make a comment on that. Otherwise, I'm happy to take it.
Well, I think you're far better qualified to answer that than I am.
Sure.
But I can say it was a great pleasure for me to work with and help the Heinze Trust obtain a property that actually adjoins my farm. So.
Yes, yeah, that was really wonderful. Yeah, so Shirley Heinze Land Trust works with conservation partners all over Northwest Indiana to do what we call conservation action planning. So if you have questions about that, you can reach out to us specifically about that. But ultimately, it comes down to money and landowners being willing to protect their properties. So.
I don't have any more questions on the chat from any of our viewers on Zoom. Sarah, do you have anything else from Facebook?
So Taryn says, I have seen many different methods of using moss and algae to absorb carbon, especially in urban communities. Is this something that might be more prevalent in the future?
Is the removal of it going to be more prevalent?
She's saying that there have been instances where they use it to absorb carbon.
Oh, okay. And I assume that there are species that you could, but the ones that I was focusing on are the ones that are clearly detrimental. And when I had that part of the discussion, you're not going to find a lot in the literature, particularly the part about dew. These are observations that I've been making. I was only able to find a couple of references. One of them is a study that was done in Iowa that showed that the actual dew point was going up. That's a temperature at which, when the temperature comes down at night from a high temperature and it comes down to the dew point temperature, that's where dew actually forms. So if the temperature never gets that way, and this is where we've been for years and years, but now the dew point temperature is up, so night after night after night, we have dew forming heavily on our buildings. I just saw this afternoon, I looked and I found in South Bend, the dew point temperature last summer was 69 degrees. So it might have been 80, but as soon as it gets down to 69 degrees, we're forming dew. And dew is what you, of course, a lot of us see it as fog in the fall and the late summer and fall. It cools off the low-lying areas. That's when the humidity gets to 100% in those areas. And that's what, in my view, we're seeing a lot more of, but I haven't seen it in the literature. And but the only thing that supports that in the literature is that the dew point temperatures are rising. So it makes sense. We're going to have more condensation occurring from the massive amount of moisture that we have in the air than we ever used to have before.
Well, this has been so interesting. I think we've worked through our questions. I think we all learned a lot. So thank you so much, Larry, for coming to speak to us about from your personal and professional experience. It's been really, really informative.
There have been lots of people saying thank you on the chat here as well. So it seems like everybody's really enjoyed your presentation. Thank you for your time.
I'll tell you what, if there is anybody, let me see here. Let me hold this up so that you can see it. On there is my email address. If anybody wants to email me, it's simply larrycadwell2@gmail. If you have any additional questions, or if you have comments, particularly about mold on houses and your gardens and dew, those kind of things, because that's what I'm not seeing in the literature, but I'm seeing in person. So I'm interested in more observations that either debunk my harebrained idea or actually support it. And then the other things I put here are some resources. Where did I get a lot of this information? And these, all you have to do is Google these, but Climate Central is one of them. I mentioned also the Union of Concerned Scientists, the Purdue Climate Change Research Center, and what is the last of, the National Climate Assessment. And this is an important one, the National Climate Assessment. It's volume 4. It came out the first issue in 2017 of that one, and the second one in 2018. And this is really telling us a lot about what the government has been determining about where climate is going and how it's affecting our environment. The first part was most on the physical side of it, and this second part on the biological and ecological side of it. So those are valued resources, and you simply have to Google a couple of names and you can pretty readily come up with those. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you for your time. Yes, go ahead.
Sorry. Now that all the questions are over, I feel like I can handle it. Thank you so much for joining us, everyone. Have a wonderful rest of your night. Again, reach out to Larry and participate in some community science if you've noticed any of your kind of own curious things happening in your own yard with your tomatoes or your siding and mildew and such. And we'll have more events similar to this on different topics in the future, so check out our website.
Thank you, everyone. Have a good evening.